The prince's beast killed everyone who entered, until it smelled a human's dog on him. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. The imperial palace of Velrathia stretched across the horizon like a crystalline mountain range, its towers piercing the violet sky of the capital world. Within its deepest chambers, far from the golden halls where diplomats gathered and treaties were signed, there existed a wing that no one willingly entered. The guards stationed at its entrance wore expressions of grim resignation, and the servants who delivered supplies did so with trembling hands, leaving their burdens at marked locations before fleeing. This was the wing that housed the creature known only as the Beast, and it belonged to Prince Davrin, heir to the Velrathian throne. Kyle Dawson had been working as a maintenance technician on Velrathia for 8 months, and in all that time, he had never been anywhere near the Forbidden Wing. His job was simple enough, fixing the environmental systems in the diplomatic quarters, replacing worn components in the transport tubes, and ensuring the vast palace infrastructure continued functioning. It was good work, honest work, and it paid well enough for him to send money back to Earth while saving for his eventual return. He shared a modest apartment in the worker district with 3 other humans, and he spent his evenings either reading or video calling his family back home. His life was predictable, comfortable, and utterly unremarkable. That changed on a morning when Kyle was summoned to the office of High Administrator Torvin, a Velrathian official whose scales shimmered with the deep purple that indicated high rank. Kyle had never met anyone above the level of shift supervisor before, so the summons filled him with a mixture of curiosity and dread. Had he made some mistake? Was his contract being terminated? Torvin's office was located in one of the administrative towers, a space filled with holographic displays and the faint hum of data processors. The High Administrator himself was an imposing figure, nearly 8 feet tall with the distinctive horn ridge that marked Velrathian nobility. His eyes, golden with vertical pupils, fixed on Kyle with an intensity that made the human suddenly very aware of how small he was in comparison. "Kyle," the High Administrator said, his voice carrying the harmonics that all Velrathians possessed. "You have been selected for a task of great importance." Kyle shifted his weight, uncomfortable under that piercing gaze. "Selected, sir? For what exactly?" Torvin gestured to a holographic display that materialized between them. It showed a schematic of the palace, with one section highlighted in red. "You are aware of the restricted wing in the southern section of the palace?" "I know it exists, sir. Everyone knows. But we're told to stay away from it." "Indeed. That wing houses the private chambers of Prince Davrin, along with his companion, the Beast." Kyle felt his stomach tighten. He had heard the stories, whispered among the workers during breaks. The Beast was supposedly some kind of predator from a death world, massive and unstoppable, with a taste for flesh. It was said that Prince Davrin had found it as a cub during one of his expeditions and raised it as a pet, but as it grew, so did its danger. Some claimed it had killed dozens of servants. Others said hundreds. The truth was impossible to know because no one who went into that wing ever talked about what they saw there. "Sir," Kyle began carefully, "I'm just a maintenance tech. I work on environmental systems and basic repairs. I don't have any experience with dangerous animals." Torvin's expression remained neutral. "You misunderstand. We are not asking you to handle the Beast. We are asking you to repair a critical life support system that has failed in Prince Davrin's chambers. The prince has been away on a diplomatic mission for the past 3 weeks, but he returns tomorrow. The repairs must be completed before then." Kyle's mind raced. If the prince is away, then the Beast is alone in there? Correct. It has been fed remotely through automated systems. However, the environmental controls have malfunctioned, and the temperature in the chambers has dropped to dangerous levels. If not corrected, the Beast will die before the prince returns. This is unacceptable. There was something in Torvin's tone that suggested the consequences of the Beast's death would be severe, not just for whoever was responsible, but potentially for the entire palace staff. "Sir," Kyle said slowly, "why me? There must be dozens of technicians with more experience, more seniority." "There were," Torvin replied. "We sent 3 of them yesterday. None succeeded." Kyle felt ice forming in his chest. "What happened to them?" Torvin's golden eyes didn't blink. "The Beast killed them. It guards the prince's chambers absolutely. Any who enter are perceived as threats and eliminated immediately. The room seemed to tilt slightly. Kyle gripped the edge of Torvin's desk. Then how am I supposed to succeed where they failed? I'll just be another body. Perhaps. However, we have reviewed your file. You are human, yes? Kyle nodded, not trusting his voice. Humans have certain characteristics that make them unique among the species we have encountered. Your capacity for forming bonds with predator species is well documented. We believe there may be a chance, however small, that the beast will react differently to you. That's not a plan, sir. That's a hope. Torvin's expression hardened. It is the plan we have. The alternative is to sedate the beast remotely, but our medical staff informs us that the dosage required could kill it given its current stress state. Prince Davrin has made it clear that any harm that comes to his companion will result in severe consequences for those responsible. You are our best option. Kyle wanted to refuse. Every instinct screamed at him to walk out of the office and never look back. But he thought about his contract, about the money he was sending home, about the black mark that refusing a direct order would place on his record. He thought about his younger sister's medical bills and his mother's struggling bakery. He thought about how hard it had been to get this position in the first place. If I do this, Kyle said quietly, I want hazard pay. Triple rate. Torvin didn't hesitate. Agreed. Additionally, if you succeed, you will receive a bonus equal to 6 months' salary. That got Kyle's attention. That kind of money would change everything for his family. It would clear his sister's debts and give his mother enough capital to expand the bakery. It was enough to justify the risk. Maybe. I'll do it, Kyle said, surprised at the steadiness in his own voice. But I'll need time to prepare and access to whatever information you have about the beast. You have until 0600 tomorrow. The prince's ship arrives at 0800. The repairs must be completed before then. Kyle nodded, his mind already racing through the logistics. What kind of predator am I dealing with? What are its capabilities? Torvin waved a hand, and the holographic display changed, showing a creature that made Kyle's breath catch. It was enormous, easily the size of an earth bear, but built more like a great cat, with sleek muscle visible beneath dark fur that seemed to absorb light. Its head was broad and powerful, with a jaw that could clearly crush bone. But what struck Kyle most were its eyes, intelligent and amber, watching the camera with an awareness that went beyond mere animal cunning. It's called a night fawn, Torvin explained. Native to the death world of Kreneth. Apex predator. Capable of moving in complete silence despite its size. Reflexes that exceed most other known species. Bite force sufficient to shear through combat armor. The prince acquired it as a juvenile 10 years ago. It is now fully grown and completely loyal to him alone. Has it ever hurt the prince? Never. By all accounts, it is gentle with him. But with anyone else, Torvin paused, his meaning clear. Kyle studied the image, trying to see beyond the obvious danger. There was something in the creature's posture, in the way it held itself, that reminded him of something. It took him a moment to place it, and when he did, a small spark of hope ignited in his chest. Sir, does the beast stay in the prince's chambers constantly, or does it have its own space? It has a large enclosure connected to the prince's personal rooms. That is where it spends most of its time when the prince is absent. The environmental controls that have failed are located in a maintenance corridor adjacent to the enclosure. You will need to access them through a service entrance. So I might not actually have to enter the enclosure itself. The corridor has reinforced walls, but there is a section where maintenance access requires proximity to the enclosure barrier. The beast will know you are there. Whether it attempts to breach the barrier or not depends on factors we cannot predict. Kyle nodded slowly, a plan beginning to form. I'll need some equipment. Personal items from my quarters. Torvin looked suspicious. What kind of items? Just trust me, sir. If you want me to have any chance of surviving this, I need to do it my way. The High Administrator studied him for a long moment, then nodded. You will have 2 hours. Use them wisely. Kyle left the office with his heart pounding and his hands shaking. 2 hours to prepare for a task that had already killed 3 experienced technicians. 2 hours to figure out how to survive an encounter with a creature specifically evolved to kill. 2 hours to make peace with the very real possibility that he was about to die. He went straight to his apartment, his mind churning. His roommates were all on shift, so he had the place to himself. He went to his small room, barely large enough for a bed and a storage locker, and began gathering what he needed. His toolkit went into a work bag, along with spare components for environmental systems. But then he added other things, items that wouldn't make sense to anyone watching. A worn flannel shirt, unwashed, that he'd worn on his last day off. A small container of treats that he kept in his locker. And most importantly, a photo that he pulled from the frame on his bedside table. The photo showed Kyle on his last day on Earth before leaving for Velrathia, standing in his parents' backyard with his arms around a large golden retriever named Cooper. The dog had been Kyle's companion for 12 years. From puppyhood to the dignified senior, Kyle had tearfully hugged goodbye. Cooper had died 3 months after Kyle left Earth, peacefully in his sleep according to his mother's message. Kyle had grieved alone in his tiny apartment, unable to return home for the funeral he'd given his best friend. He looked at Cooper's face in the photo, remembering the weight of the dog's head on his knee, the thumping of his tail against the floor, the way he would groan in contentment when Kyle scratched behind his ears. Cooper had been more than a pet. He had been family, a constant presence through some of the hardest years of Kyle's life. And that, Kyle hoped, would make all the difference. He tucked the photo carefully into his shirt pocket, pulled on the flannel over his work uniform, and grabbed his bag. Time to see if a gamble based on instinct and hope could overcome a death machine's programming to kill. The restricted wing was accessed through a security checkpoint manned by 6 heavily armed guards, all of them wearing the enhanced combat armor of the palace's elite security force. They watched Kyle approach with expressions that mixed pity and resignation. Clearly, they'd seen others walk this path before. Kyle Dawson, Kyle identified himself. I'm here to perform maintenance in Sector 7 Delta. The guard captain, a scarred Velrathian veteran with one eye replaced by a cybernetic implant, nodded slowly. We know who you are and why you're here. I'm required to inform you that once you pass this checkpoint, you will be on your own. We cannot assist you if you encounter difficulties. Understood, Kyle said, his mouth dry. The captain hesitated, then added in a lower voice, the humans who died yesterday, they went in confident. Experienced. One of them had worked in xenozoology for 20 years. Whatever you think you know about predators, the Night Fong is different. It doesn't hesitate. It doesn't warn. It just kills. I appreciate the warning, Kyle said, but I don't have a choice. Everyone has a choice, the captain replied. You could walk away right now. No one would think less of you. Kyle thought about his sister's smile in their last video call, about the dark circles under his mother's eyes that she tried to hide, about Cooper's tail wagging in the photo over his heart. Yes, they would, he said quietly. I would. The captain stepped aside, gesturing to a heavy security door that began to iris open with a hiss of hydraulics. May fortune favor you, human. Kyle walked through the door into a corridor that was noticeably cooler than the rest of the palace. Emergency lighting cast everything in a dim blue glow, and he could see his breath misting in the air. The environmental failure was severe. If the creature inside was cold-blooded, it would already be in distress. But Nightfangs, according to the brief research he'd managed to do, were warm-blooded predators from a cold mountainous world. The temperature drop would be uncomfortable, but not immediately lethal. Small comfort. The corridor stretched ahead for 50 meters before branching. Kyle checked the schematic on his datapad, confirming his route. The maintenance access was in the left branch, down another 30 meters, then through a service panel into the crawl space that ran behind the enclosure's rear wall. The actual environmental control panel was supposedly in that crawl space, accessible but requiring him to be within 10 feet of the barrier that separated him from the Night Fawn. He tried not to think about what those other technicians had experienced, about how they died. Quick, the reports had said. That was something. Kyle reached the branch and turned left, and that's when he heard it. A sound so low it was almost below the threshold of hearing, a rumble that seemed to vibrate through the floor itself. Not a growl exactly, more like the purr of a cosmic engine, if that engine was alive and hunting. The Nightfang knew he was here. Kyle's hands were shaking as he reached the service panel. He set down his bag and pulled out a powered screwdriver, removing the panel's fasteners with methodical care. The rumbling sound continued, unchanging, a reminder that he was being observed by something that could probably kill him faster than he could scream. The panel came free and Kyle set it aside, revealing a narrow crawl space that stretched into darkness. He pulled a light from his belt and shone it into the space, seeing the tangle of conduits and cables that supplied the environmental systems. And there, about 8 meters in, he could see the control panel he needed to access, its indicator lights dark. There was no way around it. He had to go in there. Kyle took several deep breaths, forcing his racing heart to slow. Then he pulled off his flannel shirt and draped it over his shoulders like a cape, the worn fabric hanging down his back. He took the container of treats from his bag and slipped it into his pocket alongside Cooper's photo. Finally, he clipped his tool belt around his waist and picked up his light. The crawl space was barely wide enough for his shoulders. Kyle had to move in an awkward crouch, shuffling forward on his knees. The light cast strange shadows on the walls, and every few meters he passed grills that provided ventilation. Through one of these grills, he knew, he would be able to see into the Night Fang's enclosure. And it would be able to see him. He'd made it maybe 5 meters when he found the first body. Or rather, what was left of one. The technician's uniform was shredded, and there was dried blood on the walls of the crawl space. The body itself had been dragged away, presumably through one of the ventilation grills, which meant the Night Fang had somehow torn through the supposedly reinforced barrier. Kyle felt his stomach churn and had to fight the urge to back out immediately. But he pressed on, crawling past the stain and the torn uniform, focusing on the control panel ahead. 3 more meters. Then 2. The rumbling sound was louder now, resonating through the metal walls around him. He could feel it in his chest, in his bones. 1 meter. Kyle reached the control panel and pulled out his diagnostic scanner. The light from the device cast a green glow as he ran through the system check. As Torvin had said, the primary heat exchanger had failed, along with 2 backup systems. It was a cascade failure, the kind that required manual reset and component replacement. It would take him at least 20 minutes to fix, probably longer in the cramped space. 20 minutes with a killer predator just on the other side of the wall. He got to work, trying to ignore the rumbling and the way his hands wanted to shake. He removed the failed heat exchanger first, a cylindrical component about the size of a coffee can, and set it aside. Then he pulled a replacement from his tool belt and began the careful process of installing it, making sure all the connections were secure. That's when he heard a different sound. A snuffling, like something with a very large nose was sniffing at the air near one of the ventilation grills. Kyle froze, his hands still on the heat exchanger. He turned his head slowly and saw that the grill to his right, less than an arm's length away, was no longer empty. There was something on the other side, visible only as a shadow that blocked the dim light from the enclosure. The Night Fang had found him. For several heartbeats, neither moved. Kyle barely dared to breathe. The shadow on the other side of the grill remained still, but he could hear the snuffling continue, could imagine the creature's nostrils flaring as it analyzed his scent. Then, in a voice that was surprisingly steady, Kyle spoke. "Hey there, buddy. I'm not here to hurt you. Just fixing the heater so you don't freeze." The snuffling stopped. The shadow shifted slightly. Kyle could see now that what he was looking at was the creature's head, massive and dark, pressed close to the grill. In the faint light, he caught a glimpse of one amber eye, watching him with that same intelligence he'd seen in the briefing hologram. "Your prince is coming home tomorrow," Kyle continued softly, still not moving. "He'll want you to be okay. So I'm just going to finish this repair and get out of your space, all right? No drama." The Night Fang made a sound, a huffing that might have been curiosity or might have been the prelude to an attack. Kyle decided to take the chance. Moving very slowly, he reached into his pocket and pulled out Cooper's photo. He held it up to the grill, letting what little light there was illuminate the image. "That's Cooper," Kyle said, and his voice caught slightly. "He was my best friend. Had him for 12 years. He died while I was away on this stupid planet, and I never got to say goodbye." The Night Fang's eye moved, focusing on the photo. The rumbling sound had stopped entirely. In the silence that followed, Kyle could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. "He was a good boy," Kyle whispered. "The best boy, and I miss him every single day." Then Kyle did something that would have seemed insane to anyone watching. He pressed the photo against the grill, letting it rest there for a moment, then pulled back his hand and returned the photo to his pocket. Instead, he reached for his flannel shirt, the one he'd worn on his last day with Cooper, the one that he'd deliberately not washed because it still carried Cooper's scent mixed with his own. He pulled a small section of the fabric close to the grill. Can you smell him? Kyle asked. Can you smell my dog? The Night Fang's nose appeared at the grill, a dark shape with flaring nostrils. It sniffed at the fabric, once, twice, 3 times. Then it made a sound that Kyle had never expected to hear from a creature supposedly engineered for death. It whined, a high, uncertain sound that spoke of recognition and confusion. The sound of a social predator encountering the scent of a pack mate, but from a stranger. Kyle felt tears prickling at his eyes. Yeah, he said softly. He was pack too, wasn't he? That's what you smell. Pack. The Night Fang pulled back from the grill, and for a moment Kyle thought he'd lost the connection. But then he heard a different sound, a rhythmic thumping that he couldn't immediately identify. He shifted position, trying to get a better angle to see through the grill, and that's when he realized what it was. The Night Fang was wagging its tail. The massive death machine, the creature that had killed 3 people just yesterday, was wagging its tail like an oversized puppy who'd just found a friend. Kyle started to laugh, a slightly hysterical sound that he couldn't quite control. Oh my God, he breathed. You're just a big dog, aren't you? A really, really big dog who happens to be able to kill people. The tail thumping continued. The Night Fang made another sound, a sort of questioning rumble that was completely different from the threatening noise Kyle had heard earlier. It was the sound of an animal seeking social connection, seeking acknowledgement. Okay, buddy, Kyle said, wiping at his eyes. I need to finish this repair, but I'm going to keep talking to you, okay? And when I'm done, maybe we can be friends. He turned back to the control panel, his hands now steady. As he worked, he kept up a running commentary, talking to the Night Fang the way he used to talk to Cooper during long evenings at home. He told it about Earth, about his family, about the bakery his mother ran, and how the smell of fresh bread would fill their house every morning. He told it about his sister's illness, about the crushing debt that had driven him to take this job so far from home. And he told it about Cooper, about the day his father had brought home a squirming golden puppy as a surprise for Kyle's 10th birthday, about teaching Cooper to fetch and to sit and to shake paws, about the time Cooper had stolen an entire roast chicken off the kitchen counter and hidden under Kyle's bed to eat it, and how they'd both gotten in trouble when his mother found the evidence. About lazy summer afternoons throwing a ball in the park and cold winter nights with Cooper pressed against him, a furry furnace of unconditional love. The Night Fang listened to all of it, occasionally snuffling at the grill or making small sounds of acknowledgement. The tail thumping had stopped, but Kyle could sense the creature's attention, its focus. It wasn't just tolerating his presence anymore. It was interested. By the time Kyle finished replacing the secondary backup systems and ran the final diagnostic check, nearly 40 minutes had passed. The control panel's lights flickered green, and he felt the subtle change in air temperature as the environmental systems came back online. He'd done it. The repair was complete. He sat back on his heels in the cramped space, suddenly aware of how exhausted he was. The adrenaline that had kept him sharp was beginning to fade, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness. All done, he said to the Night Fang. Your room should start warming up now. The prince will come home tomorrow, and everything will be okay. The creature made a sound that might have been satisfaction or might have been disappointment. Kyle couldn't tell, but then it did something that made him catch his breath. A paw appeared through the grill, or rather, through where the grill had been, because somehow during the time Kyle had been working, the Night Fang had quietly removed the barrier. The paw was enormous, easily the size of Kyle's head, with claws that gleamed in the light from his belt. It could have killed him with a single swipe. Instead, it rested gently on the floor of the crawl space, just inches from Kyle's knee. An offering, a request. Kyle looked at that massive paw for a long moment, weighing the risk. This creature had killed 3 people. It was a predator from a death world, unpredictable and dangerous. Touching it could be the last thing he ever did. But he thought about Cooper's paw, heavy and warm in his hand during their last moments together. He thought about the trust that existed between humans and the predators they called friends, the inexplicable bond that transcended logic and safety. He reached out and rested his hand on the Night Fang's paw. The fur was softer than he'd expected, dense and warm. He could feel the massive bones underneath, the power contained in that single limb. The Night Fang made a sound, that deep rumbling purr that Kyle now recognized as contentment. Then, very carefully, It turned its paw and extended its claws, not to attack, but to gently rest on top of Kyle's hand. The gesture was so deliberate, so controlled, that Kyle felt his throat tighten. "Good boy," he whispered. "You're such a good boy." He stayed like that for several minutes, hand on paw, feeling the warmth of living connection across species and worlds. Then, reluctantly, he pulled back. "I have to go now," he said. "But thank you for letting me fix your home. Thank you for not killing me." The night fawn withdrew its paw, and Kyle heard it move away from the grill. He gathered his tools and began the awkward shuffle back toward the service panel entrance. When he finally emerged into the corridor, filthy and exhausted, he felt like he'd lived a lifetime in the past hour. The walk back to the security checkpoint seemed longer than the walk in. The guards straightened in surprise when they saw him approaching, clearly not having expected anyone to return alive. The captain stepped forward, his cybernetic eye whirring as it focused. "You're alive," the captain said, and there was genuine surprise in his voice. "The environmental systems?" "Repaired and functioning," Kyle reported. "Temperature should return to normal within a few hours." "And the night fawn?" Kyle hesitated, then smiled slightly. "We came to an understanding." The captain studied him for a long moment. "I've been stationed here for 8 years," he said finally. "I've never seen anyone come out of that wing alive after encountering the beast. Whatever you did, human, it worked." "I just treated it like what it is," Kyle replied. "A highly intelligent social predator that's lonely and scared because its pack leader is gone. Not so different from dogs back on Earth." The captain's expression suggested he thought Kyle was insane, but he stepped aside and let him pass through the checkpoint. Kyle went straight to High Administrator Torvin's office, not even bothering to clean up first. He was covered in dust and grime, and there was dried blood on his knees from crawling past the remains of the previous technician, but he didn't care. Torvin looked up from his desk as Kyle entered, his golden eyes widening slightly at the human's appearance. "The repair? Complete," Kyle said. "The prince's chambers will be at optimal temperature by the time he arrives tomorrow." Torvin sat back in his chair, clearly struggling to process what he was seeing. "You encountered the night fawn?" "I did. And yet you live." "How?" Kyle pulled Cooper's photo from his pocket, now slightly crumpled and stained with dust. "I showed it my dog," he said simply. "Or rather, I let it smell my dog's scent. Turns out your supposedly unstoppable killing machine is just a very large canine analog that recognizes pack bonds. It was lonely, Administrator. That's all. Lonely and protective." Torvin stared at the photo, then at Kyle, then back at the photo. "Are you suggesting that the creature spared you because you smell like another predator?" "Not just any predator. A pack predator. A companion animal. The night fawn is bonded to Prince Davrin, but the prince has been gone for 3 weeks. That's an eternity for a social creature. When it smelled Cooper on me, it recognized something familiar. Something safe." Torvin was quiet for a long moment. "If what you say is true, this could have significant implications for how we handle the beast in the future. The deaths of those technicians were regrettable but deemed necessary risks. If there is a way to safely interact with the creature, the prince would want to know." Kyle felt a spark of anger. Those technicians died because no one thought to consider the Night Fang's psychology. You treated it like a mindless killing machine instead of what it actually is, an intelligent being capable of complex social reasoning. On Earth, we've lived with predators for thousands of years. We know how to read them, how to work with them. You could have consulted with human experts before sending people to their deaths. Torvin's scales rippled, a sign of discomfort. "Your point is noted, human. However, that is a matter for later discussion. For now, you have fulfilled your contract. The agreed-upon payment will be transferred to your account, along with the bonus." Kyle nodded, too tired to feel triumphant. "Is there anything else, Administrator?" "One thing." Torvin pulled up a holographic display showing the crawl space where Kyle had worked. "Our sensors indicate that the night fawn removed a ventilation grill during your time in the maintenance corridor. It could have accessed you directly, but chose not to. Do you know why?" Kyle thought about that massive paw resting in his hand, about the deliberate gentleness of those deadly claws. "Because I treated it with respect," he said. "Because I let it know I wasn't a threat. Because for a few minutes, I gave it what it needed most." Connection. Torvin deactivated the display. "The prince returns at 0800 tomorrow. He will want a full report on the environmental failure and its repair." You will need to be present for that briefing. Kyle groaned inwardly. Tomorrow was supposed to be his day off. But he nodded. I'll be here. He left the administrator's office and made his way back to his apartment. His roommates were home now, and they stared at him as he walked in looking like he'd been dragged through a maintenance duct, which wasn't far from the truth. Kyle, what the hell happened to you? Asked Marcus, a structural engineer from Luna Colony. Kyle collapsed onto their threadbare couch. You wouldn't believe me if I told you. But he did tell them, once he'd showered and changed and could think straight again. He told them about the night fong and the flannel shirt and Cooper's photo. He told them about the massive paw in his hand and the sound of a tail thumping. His roommates listened with expressions that ranged from disbelief to horror to amazement. You're the luckiest idiot in the galaxy, Marcus said finally. That thing should have torn you apart. It probably would have, Kyle admitted. If I hadn't lost Cooper. If I hadn't been wearing that shirt. If I hadn't spent 12 years learning to read a dog's body language and vocalizations. A lot of ifs. So what happens now? Asked Jenna, their logistics coordinator. Do they send you back in every time something breaks? Kyle hadn't thought about that. God, I hope not. Once was more than enough. But even as he said it, he knew it was a lie. Despite the terror, despite the very real possibility of death, something about that encounter had touched him deeply. For the first time since leaving Earth, since losing Cooper, he'd felt truly connected to another living being. The night fong might be an alien predator from a death world, but in that moment when their hands, human and otherwise, had touched, they'd understood each other. He slept poorly that night, his dreams filled with amber eyes and the sound of claws on metal. He woke before dawn and dressed in his cleanest work uniform, trying to look presentable for the prince's briefing. His roommates were still asleep as he left the apartment and made his way through the dawn-lit streets of the Palace Worker District. The palace was more active than usual, with servants and officials rushing to prepare for the prince's return. Kyle made his way to the administrative tower where Torvin had told him the briefing would take place, only to be redirected by a harried assistant to a different location entirely. The prince wishes to meet you in his chambers, the assistant explained. He wants to see the Night Fang's condition for himself. Kyle felt his stomach drop. He was going to have to go back into the restricted wing, but this time with the prince present. He didn't know if that made it safer or more dangerous. The security checkpoint guards recognized him and waved him through without comment, though the captain gave him a nod that might have been respect. Kyle made his way down the now familiar corridor, past the service panel he'd entered yesterday, to a set of large ornate doors that marked the entrance to the prince's personal chambers. They opened as he approached, sliding apart with a whisper of hydraulics. The chambers beyond were vast, easily the size of Kyle's entire apartment building. The walls were decorated with trophies from hunts and expeditions, weapons and artifacts from 100 worlds. But what drew Kyle's attention was the enormous enclosure that took up the far side of the room. A space that mimicked a mountainous environment with artificial rocks and a small stream. And in the center of that enclosure, lying on a heated stone platform, was the night fong. It was even more impressive in full light. Its dark fur seemed to shimmer with hidden depth, and its massive frame radiated contained power. But what struck Kyle most was that it didn't look threatening. It looked peaceful, its head resting on its paws, its amber eyes half closed in contentment. So, a voice said from behind Kyle, making him jump. You are the human who saved my friend. Kyle turned to find himself facing Prince Davrin. The prince was tall even for a Velrathian, his scales a deep royal purple that seemed to glow with inner light. He wore simple robes rather than formal attire, and his expression was one of open curiosity. Your Highness, Kyle said, dropping into the awkward half-bow that humans used when greeting Velrathian nobility. I was just doing my job. Your job was to repair an environmental system, the prince said, moving past Kyle to approach the enclosure. You were not required to risk your life by making contact with Shara. Shara? Kyle had never heard the Night Fang's actual name before. Her name, the prince confirmed. She was a gift from the chieftain of the Krenith mountain clans, given to me when I helped broker peace between their tribes and the lowland settlers. She was barely weaned, small enough to fit in my arms. Now, he smiled, she is somewhat larger. As if responding to her name, the night fong, Shara, raised her head and looked toward the prince. The change in her demeanor was immediate and obvious. Her tail began to wag, and she made a sound that was part purr, part whine. Then she stood, her massive body uncoiling with liquid grace, and bounded across the enclosure toward the prince. Kyle took an involuntary step back, certain he was about to witness a collision that would flatten the prince. But Davrin laughed and opened his arms, and Shara crashed into him with enough force that it should have knocked him down. Somehow, the prince stayed on his feet, his hands buried in Shara's fur as she wriggled against him like a puppy despite her size. "I missed you too, girl," the prince said, scratching behind Shara's ears in a way that made one of her massive hind legs start to kick. "Yes, I know. 3 weeks is far too long." Kyle watched the reunion with a mixture of joy and homesickness. It was like watching someone come home to their dog after a deployment, the same unrestrained joy and relief. Shara made rumbling sounds of happiness, pressing her head against the prince's chest, nearly knocking him over in her enthusiasm. Finally, after several minutes of reunification, the prince gently pushed Shara back and turned to Kyle. "Administrator Torvin sent me the security recordings from yesterday," he said. "I saw what you did, how you spoke to her, how you showed her the picture of your companion animal." Kyle felt heat rising in his cheeks. "I wasn't sure it would work," he admitted. "I just knew that if she was anything like dogs from Earth, she'd be missing her person and would respond to the right approach." The prince studied him for a long moment. "In the 10 years I have had Shara, no one has successfully approached her without my presence except you. The guards call her the Beast. They fear her. Even my own family refuses to enter these chambers. She killed 3 people 2 days ago," Kyle said quietly. "That fear isn't unreasonable. They approached her as a threat to be contained," the prince replied. "They wore armor. They carried weapons. They moved with aggression. Shara is a predator, human. She responds to body language and intent. You approached her with nothing but pictures and scent and a kind voice. You treated her as a thinking being rather than a monster." Kyle shrugged. "That's how we treat animals on Earth. Well, some of us do. Others see them as lesser beings or resources. But those of us who have companion animals, we know better. We know they think and feel and form bonds." The prince gestured to a seating area in the corner of the chamber. "Walk with me. I wish to discuss something with you." Kyle followed, very aware of Shara's amber eyes tracking his movement. The night fog had settled back onto her heated platform, but her attention was entirely on Kyle now. As they passed near the enclosure, Shara made a soft chuffing sound. "She remembers you," the prince said with evident surprise. "I have never seen her react this way to anyone but myself. I spent almost an hour talking to her yesterday," Kyle explained. "I told her about my life, my family, my dog. I guess she appreciated the company." They reached the seating area, and the prince gestured for Kyle to sit. It was surreal, a maintenance technician sharing furniture with royalty, but Kyle was too tired to worry about protocol. The prince settled into a chair across from him, his expression thoughtful. "I understand you are here on a limited contract," the prince said. 6 more months before you return to Earth?" "That's the plan," Kyle confirmed. "Though I'm hoping to extend if the money's good enough. My family has debts." The prince nodded. "I have reviewed your file. Your sister's medical expenses. Your mother's business struggles. You send most of your earnings back to them." Kyle felt uncomfortable having his personal finances discussed by royalty. "It's what family does," he said. "They need help and I can provide it. Simple as that." "Not so simple for everyone," the prince observed. "Many would keep their earnings for themselves. But that is not why I asked you here. I have a proposition for you, human." Kyle Dawson. Kyle's stomach tightened. Here it comes. Another impossible task. Another near-death experience. But what the prince said next was completely unexpected. "I wish to hire you as Shara's handler during my absences." Kyle blinked. "I'm sorry, what?" The prince leaned forward. "I am heir to the throne. My duties require me to travel extensively, to attend diplomatic functions, to represent our people across the sector. Shara cannot always accompany me. When I am gone, she is left alone, fed by automated systems, but without companionship. Yesterday's incident with the technicians was not the first. It has happened before. Will happen again unless something changes. So you want me to," Kyle struggled to process this, "to babysit your alien death tiger?" "I want you to be her companion when I cannot be here," the prince clarified. "To ensure she has social interaction. To walk with her in her enclosure. to provide the connection that a social predator requires. Your Highness, I'm a maintenance technician. I fix air conditioners and replace broken pipes. I don't have any formal training in alien zoology or predator management. You have something more valuable than training, the prince said. You have instinct. You understand, in a way that my people do not, how to communicate with predator species. This is a uniquely human trait. Your species evolved alongside creatures like Shera. You domesticated them, partnered with them. My people never did this. To Velrathians, predators are enemies to be feared or resources to be exploited. We do not befriend them. Kyle thought about Cooper, about the bond they'd shared. He thought about the way Shera had responded to him yesterday, the moment when palm met hand. Maybe there was something to what the prince was saying. Maybe humans did have an advantage when it came to understanding predators. But still, what you're asking, it's dangerous. I got lucky yesterday. Next time I might not. I would provide training, the prince said. Shera would be introduced to your presence gradually, with my supervision. You would learn her signals, her moods, her needs, and you would be compensated accordingly. Triple your current salary, with bonuses for each successful care period. Kyle did the math in his head. That kind of money would clear his sister's debts in months rather than years. It would give his mother enough capital to not just expand the bakery, but to open a second location. It would change everything. But it would also mean spending significant time with a creature that had killed people. A creature that, for all its apparent friendliness toward him, was still a predator from a death world. Can I think about it? Kyle asked. The prince nodded. Take a day. But know this, human. Shera has already chosen you. Look at her. Kyle turned to look at the night fawn. Shera had moved to the edge of her enclosure closest to where they sat, her massive head resting on the barrier, amber eyes fixed on Kyle. Her tail was moving slowly back and forth, and there was something in her expression that Kyle recognized immediately. She looked hopeful. Oh no, Kyle breathed. Don't look at me like that. Like what? The prince asked, amused. Like Cooper used to look when he wanted to go for a walk. Like I'm the most important person in the world. Perhaps to her. In this moment, you are, the prince said. I have traveled the galaxy, met countless species, but I have never encountered another being quite like you humans. You have this ability to connect, to empathize, to form bonds across impossible divides. It is your greatest strength. It's also a weakness, Kyle muttered. We get attached to things we shouldn't. We make stupid decisions because of our feelings. The prince smiled. Perhaps, but it is also what makes you exceptional. Think on my offer, Kyle Dawson. If you agree, I will begin your training when I return from my next diplomatic mission in 2 days. Kyle stood, feeling like his entire world had tilted on its axis. I'll give you my answer tomorrow, he said. Is there anything else, Your Highness? Just one thing. The prince rose and walked to a console near the enclosure. He pressed a control and a section of the barrier retracted, creating an opening. Shera, come. The night fawn moved immediately, flowing through the opening with surprising grace for something so massive. She approached the prince and sat at his side, her head level with his chest. The prince rested a hand on her shoulder, and she leaned into the contact. This is Kyle, the prince said to Shera, as if the massive predator could understand every word. He is the human who helped you yesterday. He is Pack. Do you understand? Pack. Shera's amber eyes moved from the prince to Kyle, studying him with that unnerving intelligence. Then, moving slowly and deliberately, she stepped away from the prince and walked toward Kyle. Every instinct Kyle had screamed at him to run, but he forced himself to stay still. Shera approached until she was close enough that Kyle could feel the heat radiating from her body, could see the individual hairs in her dark fur. She lowered her massive head and sniffed at him, her nose working. Then she did something that made Kyle's breath catch. She very gently pressed her head against his chest, in the exact spot where Cooper used to rest his head. The weight was immense, easily 100 pounds of skull and muscle, but the gesture was unmistakably affectionate. Good girl, Kyle whispered, and without thinking, he raised his hand and rested it on top of Shera's head, scratching gently behind her ears the way he used to do with Cooper. Shera's eyes closed halfway and that deep rumbling purr started up again, vibrating through Kyle's entire body. She has accepted you, the prince said softly. This is rare. Special. Do not take it lightly. I don't, Kyle said, his hand still moving in slow circles on Shara's head. Trust me, I really don't. After another moment, Shara pulled back and returned to the prince's side. The barrier resealed, and Kyle let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. Tomorrow, the prince said. Give me your answer tomorrow. Kyle nodded and made his way out of the chamber, his mind whirling. As he walked back through the security checkpoint, the captain stepped forward. The scuttlebutt is that the prince offered you a position, the captain said. Is it true? Kyle nodded, not trusting his voice. Will you take it? I don't know. Maybe I'm crazy, but I'm thinking about it. The captain's cybernetic eye whirred as he studied Kyle. For what it's worth, I've seen a lot of people try to work with dangerous creatures. Most fail because they don't respect the danger. But you're different. You understand that the danger exists, but you also see past it to what the creature actually needs. That's rare. Kyle left the palace and spent the rest of the day walking through the capital city, trying to sort through his thoughts. Velrathia's capital was beautiful, with soaring crystal towers and gardens filled with plants from 1,000 worlds. But it wasn't home. It wasn't Earth, with its blue sky and familiar gravity and the knowledge that his family was just a few hours' drive away instead of light years. If he took this job, he would be committed to staying here for longer. Maybe much longer. The prince would want consistency, someone Shara could rely on. That meant extensions to his contract, perhaps years of them. It meant delaying his return home indefinitely, but it also meant financial security for his family. It meant his sister could get the treatments she needed without drowning in debt. It meant his mother could breathe easily for the first time in years. It meant he could make a real difference in their lives, more than just sending a paycheck home every month. And beyond the practical considerations, there was something else. Something he hadn't felt since Cooper's death. A connection, a sense of being needed by another living creature. Shara had looked at him with those amber eyes, and he'd seen the same thing he used to see in Cooper's gaze. Trust, affection, hope. How could he walk away from that? By the time Kyle returned to his apartment that evening, his mind was made up. His roommates could tell something had changed. You're going to do it, Jenna said. You're going to become that thing's handler. Kyle nodded. I think I have to. Not just for the money, though that's part of it, but because she needs someone. And apparently, I'm the only one who can give her what she needs without getting killed. You're insane, Marcus said, but there was admiration in his voice. Completely, totally insane. But also maybe the bravest person I know. Or the dumbest, Kyle said with a weak smile. Sometimes those are the same thing, Jenna replied. Kyle spent a restless night, and the next morning he made his way back to the palace. He was directed once again to the prince's chambers, where he found Prince Davrin working at a desk, while Shara dozed on her heated platform. Your Highness, Kyle said, and the prince looked up. I've made my decision. I'll do it. I'll be Shara's handler. The prince's expression broke into a genuine smile. Excellent. I am pleased. We will begin your training this afternoon. But first, there are contracts to review and security clearances to process. You will need access to restricted areas of the palace. The next 3 hours were a blur of paperwork and medical examinations and background checks that went far deeper than the ones Kyle had undergone when first hired. He was fingerprinted, retina scanned, and subjected to a psychological evaluation that asked questions ranging from the mundane to the bizarre. By the time he was done, he felt like he'd been turned inside out and examined from every angle. But finally, he was back in the prince's chambers, this time wearing a new uniform that marked him as part of the royal household. The prince waited with Shara at his side. The first lesson, Prince Davrin said, is understanding that Shara is not a pet. She is a partner, a companion. She has her own thoughts, her own desires, her own personality. You must learn to read her as she will learn to read you. Kyle nodded. Like Cooper, I never thought of him as a pet either. He was family. Precisely. Now observe. The prince moved to the enclosure and stepped inside. Shara immediately perked up, her tail beginning its characteristic wag. But the prince raised a hand and made a gesture, and Shara stilled, watching attentively. This is the signal for attention, the prince explained. It tells her to focus and wait for instruction. You will learn a dozen such signals. They are based on hand movements rather than voice commands because there may be situations where verbal communication is not possible. The prince demonstrated several more signals. Stay, come, follow, guard. Each one was distinct and Shara responded to them instantly, her movements precise despite her size. She's incredibly well trained, Kyle observed. She is intelligent, the prince corrected. Training is for animals that lack understanding. Shara understands. She chooses to cooperate because we have built trust over years. That is what you must develop with her. Not obedience, but trust. The prince beckoned Kyle forward. Now you will enter the enclosure. Move slowly, confidently. Do not show fear or hesitation. Shara can sense both and will interpret them as weakness. Kyle took a deep breath and stepped through the open barrier into Shara's domain. The Night Fawn watched him intently, her amber eyes tracking his every movement. Kyle remembered what the prince had said about body language and forced himself to stand straight, to meet Shara's gaze without flinching. Shara stood and began to circle him, sniffing at his legs, his hands, his clothing. Kyle remained still, letting her investigate. When she moved behind him, out of his line of sight, every muscle in his body tensed. This was the moment of greatest vulnerability. If she was going to attack, this would be when. But she didn't attack. Instead, she pressed her nose against the small of his back, snuffling loudly, and Kyle had to suppress a laugh because it tickled. Then she circled back around to face him and sat directly in front of him, close enough that her breath ruffled his hair. She is waiting for you to initiate contact, the prince said. If you are comfortable doing so. Kyle slowly raised his hand and rested it on Shara's head. The massive Night Fawn leaned into his touch, her eyes closing partially. Kyle began to scratch behind her ears and was rewarded with that deep rumbling purr. Good, the prince said. Now establish your position. Kyle remembered watching dog training videos on Earth, back when Cooper was a puppy. Establishing position meant making it clear who was in charge without being aggressive about it. He gently but firmly guided Shara's head down until she was looking at the ground rather than at him. Then he moved to her side and rested his other hand on her shoulder. Shara held the position for a moment, then turned her head to look at him. Her expression, if such a thing could be read on an alien predator's face, seemed approving. Then she stood and walked back to her platform, settling down as if to say the interaction was complete for now. Well done, the prince said. You have good instincts. Over the next few weeks, we will build on this foundation. You will learn to feed her, to groom her, to exercise her. You will learn her moods and what they signify. By the time I leave on my next mission, you will be prepared to care for her in my absence. The training sessions became the center of Kyle's new life. Every day, he would report to the prince's chambers and spend hours with Shara, learning her routines and preferences. He discovered that she was surprisingly playful, enjoying games of chase through her enclosure despite her massive size. He learned that she had favorite foods, preferring the blue meat from creatures native to her home world, and that she would sulk dramatically if denied treats. He also learned the signals that indicated mood and intent. When Shara's ears were forward and her tail held high, she was alert and curious. When her ears flattened and her tail went still, she was uncertain or uncomfortable. When she showed teeth and her eyes narrowed, she was genuinely angry and should be given space immediately. Most importantly, Kyle learned that Shara was capable of remarkable gentleness despite her size and strength. She could pick up objects as delicate as eggs without breaking them. She could navigate narrow spaces without disturbing anything. And she never once hurt Kyle, even accidentally, during their training sessions. The prince observed these sessions with evident satisfaction. You have a gift, he told Kyle one afternoon. In 3 weeks, you have achieved what took me months. Shara trusts you completely. I think she was lonely, Kyle replied. She just needed someone who would treat her right. Perhaps, but do not discount your own role in this. You bring something to this relationship that my people cannot. A willingness to be vulnerable, to show emotion, to connect on a level that transcends words. As the training progressed, Kyle found himself genuinely enjoying the time he spent with Shara. She was funny in unexpected ways, like the time she discovered her own reflection in a polished wall panel and spent 10 minutes trying to play with the other Night Fawn before realizing it was herself. She was affectionate, often pressing against Kyle's side and rumbling contentedly. And she was smart, learning new signals after only a few repetitions. 3 weeks after accepting the position, the prince received word of another diplomatic mission. This one would keep him away for 10 days, visiting 3 different systems to negotiate trade agreements. It would be the first real test of Kyle's ability to care for Shara alone. I have full confidence in you, the prince told Kyle the night before his departure. Shara has accepted you as her secondary pack member. She will listen to you in my absence. But remember, she is still a predator. Do not become complacent. I won't, Kyle promised. We'll be fine. The next morning, Kyle watched as the prince said goodbye to Shara. The Night Fawn clearly understood that her primary person was leaving, and she pressed against him with obvious distress, making small whining sounds. The prince spoke to her softly in the Velrathian language, his hands buried in her fur. Kyle will care for you, the prince said, finally switching to standards so Kyle could understand. He is Pack. Obey him as you would obey me. I will return soon. Then, with a final scratch behind Shara's ears, the prince left. Shara watched him go, her tail drooping, her ears flat. Kyle felt a pang of sympathy for the massive creature. He knew exactly what it felt like to be separated from someone you loved. Hey, girl, Kyle said softly, moving to Shara's side. I know. I miss him too. But we'll keep each other company, okay? And before you know it, he'll be back. Shara turned her amber eyes to Kyle, and he could see the uncertainty there. Then she pressed her head against his chest, in that gesture that reminded him so much of Cooper, and Kyle wrapped his arms around as much of her as he could reach. Good girl, he whispered. We're going to be fine. The first few days went smoothly. Kyle followed the routine the prince had established, feeding Shara at specific times, exercising her in the enclosure, and spending hours simply sitting with her, talking the way he used to talk to Cooper. He told her stories about Earth, about his family, about random memories from his childhood. Shara listened to everything, her head resting on her paws, her eyes never leaving his face. On the fourth day, Kyle had an idea. He'd been thinking about how to make Shara's time without the prince more engaging, and he remembered something from his research about canine enrichment. Dogs needed mental stimulation as much as physical exercise. Maybe Shara did too. He spent his lunch break searching through supply catalogs until he found what he was looking for. A puzzle feeder designed for large carnivores, used in zoos across the galaxy. He ordered one with rush delivery, and it arrived the next morning. Shara watched with interest as Kyle set up the puzzle feeder in her enclosure. It was essentially a series of connected compartments that could be filled with food. To access the food, Shara would need to manipulate various mechanisms, sliding panels, rotating drums, lifting lids. It was designed to engage predator problem-solving abilities. Kyle filled the compartments with Shara's favorite treats and stepped back. Okay, girl, show me how smart you are. Shara approached the feeder cautiously, sniffing at it from all angles. Then she began to investigate, her massive paws surprisingly dexterous as she manipulated the mechanisms. Within 15 minutes, she'd solved every puzzle and consumed all the treats. Then she looked at Kyle with an expression that clearly said, "More?" Kyle laughed. "You're too clever for your own good. You know that?" He refilled the feeder and this time added a few extra complications, changing the order of the mechanisms. Shara tackled it with the same systematic approach, working through each puzzle methodically. By the fifth attempt, Kyle was running out of ways to make it challenging. The prince returned 2 days early from his mission, and the reunion between him and Shara was explosive. The Night Fawn practically bowled him over in her excitement, making sounds Kyle had never heard before, chirps and squeals mixed with that rumbling purr. The prince laughed and held her, murmuring words in Velrathian that Kyle couldn't translate, but whose meaning was clear enough. When things had calmed down, the prince turned to Kyle. The reports indicate no incidents during my absence. Well done. It was easy, Kyle said honestly. Shara's a sweetheart once you get to know her. The prince noticed the puzzle feeder in the enclosure. What is this? Kyle explained his enrichment strategy, and the prince's expression grew thoughtful. This is excellent, he said. I should have thought of such things myself. You are not merely caring for Shara's physical needs, but her mental ones as well. This is exactly why I needed a human for this role. Over the following months, Kyle's role in Shara's life expanded. He became her regular companion, spending several hours each day in the enclosure even when the prince was present. He introduced new games, new puzzles, new challenges. He discovered that Shara enjoyed a Velrathian equivalent of fetch, though the objects being fetched were considerably larger and heavier than any ball Cooper had ever chased. He also began documenting Shera's behavior, noting patterns and preferences. He realized that she was more energetic in the mornings and preferred to nap in the afternoons. She didn't like loud noises but was fascinated by music, especially the classical pieces Kyle would sometimes play from his datapad. She was terrified of thunderstorms, or rather the Velrathian equivalent, and would press close to Kyle during them, seeking comfort. The palace staff, who had initially viewed Kyle's appointment with skepticism, began to see him differently. He was no longer just a maintenance tech. He was the beast's handler, a position that came with its own status and respect. Guards nodded to him in the corridors. Servants asked him questions about the Nightfall. Even High Administrator Torvin treated him with a degree of courtesy that hadn't been present before. But more than the status or the increased pay, Kyle valued the relationship he'd built with Shera. She had filled a hole in his life that he hadn't fully acknowledged existed. Since Cooper's death, he'd been functioning on autopilot, going through the motions of work and survival without any real connection to his surroundings. Shera had changed that. She'd given him a purpose beyond just earning money, a reason to look forward to each day. 6 months into his new role, the prince summoned Kyle for a meeting. This time, instead of meeting in the chambers, they met in a formal office in the administrative wing. The prince was dressed in full ceremonial robes, and his expression was unusually serious. Kyle Dawson, the prince began formally, I have observed your work with Shera these past months. You have exceeded every expectation. She is healthier, happier, and more engaged than I have ever seen her. Thank you, Your Highness. That means a lot. However, there is a complication. The prince's scales rippled in that way that indicated discomfort. My father, the Emperor, is concerned about the security risks associated with Shera. The deaths of those technicians brought unwanted attention. There are members of the court who believe Shera should be removed, either returned to Krenith or placed in a specialized facility. Kyle felt his stomach drop. You can't let them do that. She's not dangerous anymore. Not with proper handling. I agree, which is why I have proposed a solution. The prince leaned forward. I want to demonstrate to the court that Shera can be safely managed. To do this, I need to show that she can interact appropriately not just with myself and you, but with others as well. Kyle saw where this was going. You want to expand her socialization. Precisely. With your help, I want to train Shera to accept the presence of other approved individuals. Guards, servants, members of the court. If we can prove she is not a threat when properly handled, the calls for her removal will cease. It was a risky plan. Shera was comfortable with Kyle and the prince, but that didn't mean she would accept others. One wrong move, one person who approached her with fear or aggression, and there could be another death. But if they didn't try, Shera would be taken away, locked in some facility, or sent back to a world she no longer knew. I'll help, Kyle said. Whatever it takes. The socialization program began carefully. The first candidate was a palace guard named Torek, a veteran with decades of experience who had expressed interest in working with Shera. He was patient and calm, two essential qualities, and he respected the danger without being paralyzed by fear. Kyle worked with Torek for a week before allowing him near the enclosure, teaching him the signals Shera understood and explaining her body language. Then, with both Kyle and the prince present, Torek entered the enclosure for the first time. Shera's reaction was immediate wariness. Her ears flattened and her tail went still as she watched this stranger invade her space. But she didn't attack. She looked to the prince, then to Kyle, as if asking for confirmation that this was acceptable. Pack, Kyle said firmly, using the signal the prince had taught him. He gestured to Torek. Pack. Shera tilted her head, processing. Then, slowly, she approached Torek. The guard stood perfectly still as the massive Nightfang sniffed at him, investigated him, assessed him. After what felt like an eternity, Shera stepped back and made a small chuffing sound. Not friendly, but not hostile either. Acceptance. Over the next few weeks, they repeated the process with other carefully selected individuals. A servant who worked in the kitchens, a junior administrator, a healer from the medical wing. Each time, Shera was initially wary, but with Kyle and the prince vouching for the newcomer, she eventually accepted them. The day of the demonstration arrived. The grand hall of the palace had been set up with seating for the emperor and his court, with a reinforced transparent barrier separating the viewing area from a large open space where the demonstration would occur. Kyle stood in that space next to the prince, trying to ignore the dozens of eyes watching them, the whispered conversations among the nobles. The emperor himself was an imposing figure, larger than his son, with scales that had darkened with age to a deep midnight purple. His expression was skeptical as he looked at Kyle. "This is the human who claims to have tamed the beast?" the emperor asked. "Not tamed, your majesty," the prince corrected. "Bonded with. There is a difference." "We shall see," the emperor said. "Bring forth the creature." Shara entered through a side door, accompanied by two of the guards who had been part of the socialization program. She moved calmly, her head up, her bearing confident. But Kyle could see the tension in her muscles, the slight flatten of her ears that indicated she was uncomfortable with the crowd. "Come," Kyle called, using the signal. "Pack." Shara's eyes found him immediately, and she crossed the open space to his side. Kyle rested his hand on her shoulder, feeling her relax slightly at his touch. Then, in a move that caused audible gasps from the assembled court, Kyle dropped to one knee and wrapped his arms around Shara's neck in a hug. The massive predator stood perfectly still, allowing the embrace. Then, gently, she nuzzled against Kyle's shoulder, making that rumbling purr that was now so familiar to him. "As you can see," the prince said to the court, "Shara is capable of gentleness and affection when treated with respect and understanding. She is not a mindless killer. She is an intelligent being with complex social needs. Intelligence makes her more dangerous, not less," someone from the court called out. "She could choose to kill at any moment." "She could," Kyle agreed, standing. "Just like any of us could. But she doesn't because she's part of a pack. She's loyal. That's what predators like her do. They bond with their pack and protect them." The problem before wasn't Shara. It was that no one treated her like a thinking being. They treated her like a monster, so she acted like one. The emperor leaned forward in his seat. "A bold claim. Human. Can you prove it?" Kyle thought for a moment, then nodded. "Yes, your majesty. If you'll permit me." He turned to Shara and made a series of signals. "Guard. Stay. Watch." Shara's demeanor changed immediately, becoming more alert, more focused. Then Kyle walked away from her, crossing the open space to approach the transparent barrier. The court collectively held its breath as Kyle stood with his back to the night fong, vulnerable and exposed. For several heartbeats, nothing happened. Then one of the junior nobles, emboldened by stupidity or bravado, made a sudden movement, as if to rush forward. Shara exploded into motion. She crossed the distance between her position and Kyle in 3 massive bounds, placing herself between Kyle and the perceived threat. Her teeth were bared, her eyes narrowed, every line of her body radiating lethal intent. The noble who had moved froze, his face going pale. But Shara didn't attack. She held position, protecting Kyle while waiting for further instruction. Kyle turned and saw what she had done. His heart was pounding, but he kept his voice calm. "Stand down," he said, using the signal for calm. "Pack safe." Shara relaxed slightly, though she maintained her position between Kyle and the barrier. Kyle approached her and rested his hand on her head. "Good girl," he said softly. "Such a good girl." The emperor stood, his expression unreadable. "That was either incredibly brave or incredibly foolish," he said. "Both, your majesty," Kyle admitted. "But it proves the point. Shara isn't dangerous to those she considers pack. She's protective of them. That's completely different from being a threat." The emperor looked at his son. "You truly believe this creature can remain in the palace safely?" "With proper handling, yes," the prince replied. "Kyle has proven it's possible, and I am willing to take full responsibility for any incidents that may occur." The emperor was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. "Very well. The beast may remain. But," he fixed Kyle with a hard stare, "you, human, will be held accountable for her actions. If she harms anyone under your care, the consequences will be severe." "I understand, your majesty," Kyle said, relief flooding through him. "I accept that responsibility." The court session ended and Kyle led Shara back to the prince's chambers, his legs shaky with delayed reaction. That had been incredibly risky. If anything had gone wrong, if Shara had actually attacked, both he and she would have faced terrible consequences. But it had worked. Shara was safe. The prince could keep his companion. And Kyle had proven, at least to himself, that the bond between human and predator could transcend biology and worlds. That night, after Shara had been fed and settled for the evening, the prince invited Kyle to share a drink. They sat in the prince's private study, a room filled with books and artifacts from across the galaxy. "You took a great risk today," the prince said, handing Kyle a glass of something blue and luminescent. Kyle sipped it and discovered it tasted like honey and starlight. "So did you? If your father had decided against us, what would have happened to Shara?" "I would have fought that decision with everything I have," the prince said. "But I am grateful it did not come to that. You have given me a gift, Kyle Dawson. You have allowed me to keep my friend, my companion, the being I value most in this universe. I will not forget that." They talked late into the night, about Earth and Velrathia, about the nature of companionship and loyalty, about the strange paths that life sometimes took. By the time Kyle made his way back to his quarters, the palace was dark and quiet, and he felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in years. The months that followed established a new routine. Kyle's role as Shara's handler became permanent, and his salary reflected his importance to the royal household. He moved from the worker district to better quarters within the palace itself, a small apartment that was still modest by noble standards, but felt luxurious compared to what he'd had before. 2 years passed in what felt like the blink of an eye. Kyle's sister completed her treatments, debt-free, and sent him a video of her dancing at her wedding. His mother opened not one, but 3 new bakery locations, each one thriving. And Kyle found himself unable to imagine leaving Velrathia, leaving Shara, leaving the life he'd built. The prince noticed, of course. One evening, as they watched Shara play with a new puzzle Kyle had designed, Prince Davern spoke. "You were supposed to return to Earth 18 months ago." "I know," Kyle said. "I keep extending my contract." "Why?" Kyle watched Shara solve the puzzle with her usual systematic brilliance. "Because this feels like home now. Because she needs me. Because I need her." The prince smiled. "Then perhaps it is time to make it official. I am offering you permanent residency on Velrathia, along with a formal title. Royal Beastkeeper. You would be part of my household permanently." Kyle felt tears prick his eyes. He thought of Earth, of his family, of Cooper's grave that he'd never visited. But he also thought of Shara's rumbling purr, of amber eyes that lit up when he entered a room, of the pact bond that had saved them both from loneliness. "Yes," he said, "I accept." Prince Davern became Emperor Davern 5 years later, and his coronation was attended by dignitaries from across the galaxy. At his side, calm and regal, sat Shara, and beside Shara stood Kyle, wearing the formal robes of the Royal Beastkeeper, a position that had become legendary throughout the sector. They called him the human who tamed death, though Kyle always corrected them. He hadn't tamed anything. He'd simply recognized a lonely creature and offered friendship. He'd treated an alien predator the way humans had treated predators for millennia, with respect, with understanding, with love. On quiet evenings, Kyle would sit with Shara in her enclosure, his hand buried in her fur, and tell her stories about a golden retriever named Cooper, who had taught him everything he needed to know about loyalty and love. And Shara would listen, her tail thumping gently, her amber eyes content. Sometimes the greatest bonds are forged in the most unlikely places, between the most unlikely beings. A human maintenance worker and an alien predator, connected by the simple truth that all pack animals understand. Family isn't about species or planets or biology. Family is about who shows up, who stays, who loves you even when the universe says they shouldn't. Kyle had found his pack, and in doing so, he'd proven once again that humanity's greatest strength wasn't technology or weapons or conquest. It was the ability to look at something dangerous and different and say, "I see you. I understand you. And I choose to love you anyway." Shara lived to be 32 years old, ancient for a night fawn, and she passed peacefully in her sleep with Kyle's hand on her head and Emperor Davern whispering goodbye. They buried her beneath a tree imported from Kreneth, and her memorial became a place of pilgrimage for those who believed in the power of bonds across species. Kyle lived another 40 years after that, training successive handlers, writing books about xenozoology and interspecies relationships, and eventually retiring as an old man respected across the galaxy. When his time came, he was buried beside Shara and beside Cooper's collar which had been sent from Earth years before. The inscription on his memorial read simply, "He understood that all beings, regardless of origin, share the same fundamental need to be seen, to be valued, to belong to a pack." And that was the end of the story. If you listened all the way to here, don't forget to leave feedback about what you thought of the story in the comments, whether positive or negative. Your feedback helps us improve. Also, leave your like and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this one. And I'll leave here on the screen another video that I'm sure you'll like. Big hug, and see you in the next story.